Today we're going to talk about something a little controversial in timed vacuum versus manifold vacuum. When should you use either one, and then should you just get rid of all of them and go right with a race style setup with a locked out distributor? So let's talk about it. So let's first talk about timing in general. There's engine timing and there's ignition timing. They both work off the same principle, the rotation of the crankshaft and where the crank is in relationship to where the piston is, so it knows when to fire the spark plug to fire or burn the fuel and air mixture that's in the cylinder. But we have to look at also too, do we need to advance the timing or retard the timing depending on how much load is on the engine? And that's what we're going to talk about specifically today, is when do you advance the timing in the engine and how do you reference the right port on the carburetor or throttle body to get it to fire at the time that you want to fire. And that's the controversy there, is which port to use. So we're going to talk a little bit about both, and then I'll give you my example or tell you what I go to really to use first on all these. Now, why should you run a vacuum advance in a street car? And that's what we're going to concentrate on today, is more street type applications, but we're going to cross over a little bit with a locked out distributor and talk a little bit about that as well. But vacuum timing is very useful to use on a street engine to get to where you want the timing set depending on the load of the engine and the RPM of it. So when you use a vacuum advance type of distributor or ignition timing on a street car, you get a little better starting, you get better cold starting. Your driving style gets a little bit easier because you're pulling timing as the engine is demanding it, or giving it timing depending on where you're at in the RPM range and the load range. Your off idle characteristics are typically better with a vacuum advanced distributor on a street car because you're operating in a lot of different things. Your stop sitting at a stoplight. The advance is out of the engine. You're back at 20 degrees of timing wherever you have it set at, and then once you get going, the vacuum pod and the mechanical advance within the distributor will take over. But it's getting the relationship between the two that's critical. So there's some people that say that you have to run a vacuum style advance on a street car. And I don't disagree with that for the most part, but really it all depends on a couple of different things. Now, what it boils down to is which one should you use? Should you use manifold vacuum or should you use timed vacuum? So before we talk about what those are, let's talk about the factors that will give you to figure out which one you should use. So the three things you really need to concentrate on is how you plan on driving the car. Is it a street cruiser, a little bit of street strip? Is it a drag race only application? Is it a road race car, autocross car? Whatever the case may be, knowing what the driving style is the first step in it. The second is what the cam specs are. The cam is going to really dictate a lot of that because it's where it tell everything about what's going on in the engine as far as the valve train is concerned. Starts with the camshaft. So you really need to understand what the specs are, what the power operating range is, and what what the ratio is that you're working on here, because it's going to matter how the timing affects what the fuel and air is that's going into the cylinder. And the last one's compression ratio. You have to really understand what the compression ratio is and what the rest of the spec of the engine is before you can really decide on which port to use, whether it's timed or manifold. So it's kind of basic. I get it, I understand, but we have to talk about that real quick because everything else that we're going to talk about from here on out depends on what the whole package looks like, and really those three things: how you're going to drive the car, what the cam specs are, and really what the rest of the combination is. So let's talk about the three most common things, at least that I deal with, and maybe you are as well, and that is a carburetor and a throttle body EFI system and where the ports are on each. Now, if you look at the Edelbrock carburetor, on the passenger side, this is your timed port. The one on the driver's side is your manifold vacuum. On a Holley carburetor, you can see both of them are plugged here, but the one on the side of the metering block here is the timed vacuum, and this one down here in the bottom is the manifold vacuum. When you look at this throttle body EFI in particular, the one down here in the bottom is your manifold vacuum. You can see the port that it comes out of. We'll talk about that here in a quick second. And then this one up top here is your timed vacuum. Now, knowing which one is super critical, but obviously knowing where it's at on the carburetor or throttle body to hook it up properly is also key. Now let's talk about the differences between timed vacuum and manifold vacuum. The timed vacuum port, which is this one up here, is the port that is above the throttle blades in the bore. If you look at this Edelbrock carburetor, the throttle blades are down very close to the base plate of the carburetor. That vacuum port is above these throttle plates. Same with the Holley, same with this fast unit. All the timed ports are above. Timed vacuum only adds timing at part throttle or light throttle. It does not add any timing to the distributor at no throttle, at idle. It's just there's no reference from it. There's nothing that's pulling on. Everything that is above the throttle body when the blades are closed isn't drawing any vacuum. It's closed, so it doesn't pull any timing into the distributor when you're using the timed port. Now, when you're using the timed vacuum, advance always comes in a little bit later because you do have a little bit of lag time here. When you hit the throttle and the blades open up, and now the port above it is starting to read vacuum that's being pulled through the system, it takes a second or two, not really that long, but it does have some slight hesitation, and then it has to go to the distributor. The distributor has to react through the vacuum pod to advance or retard the timing, whichever the case may be. So there's always a little bit of a lag time there, and the way you cure that is at the distributor. But really, it's just understanding that, the ported or the timed vacuum, it's also what they use for the fuel economy side or the EPA side of it. It's always used on the timed vacuum port. It may be the reason why they came into play. I really don't know, but the differences between the two, that timed, like I said, is just going to be a little bit different. Like I said, no load at idle. It's not going to read any vacuum. Now let's talk about manifold vacuum. If you see on this fast throttle body, this one that's down at the bottom, and you can kind of see that reference hole right there, that is where the manifold vacuum port is reading from. It is always reading constant manifold vacuum when the engine is running, what's going on in the intake. Manifold vacuum typically requires a little bit less mechanical advance within the distributor because you're constantly under pressure. You're constantly reading what the engine vacuum is, and you usually have a little bit more initial advance when you're running manifold vacuum. The other side of that is when you've got more fuel and air going through there, or you've got a lot of fuel and air going through there, you need a little bit more fuel across the entire operating range when you're using the manifold vacuum. It's just part of it. We're talking about the time that it takes once the fuel and air mixture gets into the engine and starts to compress, and the amount of time it needs to burn. When you're using manifold vacuum, typically you need a little bit more fuel running through there, and we'll talk about that here again in a quick second of why you'd need that. But those are the main differences between the the manifold vacuum and the timed vacuum. It's just where it's drawing. Manifold is always below the throttle plates. The timed is always above the throttle plates. Now let's talk about which one or when you should use either one. Now, timed vacuum is typically used on emissions controlled vehicles, but literally we're not talking about any of that here, but it's always used there because it gives you a little bit less fuel that's needed. Remember, we just talked about the manifold vacuum requires a little bit more fuel running through the system, through the carburetor, the throttle body. The timed vacuum requires a little bit less. On vehicles with a really mild cam or a stock cam and an automatic transmission, timed vacuum is really, really good. It allows everything else to work. You don't have a really long duration in the camshaft, and when you don't have all those things, you can get away with using that timed vacuum. Now, the other side of that is manifold vacuum. When you have an aggressive camshaft, you would need to probably start tuning with manifold vacuum. It's just a better way of doing it because the longer the duration and the more RPM or the more manifold pressure that you're seeing or the engine pressure that you're seeing internally requires that you have a little bit more advance, a little bit quicker, and a little bit more initial advance. So manifold vacuum is almost always the place to start. Now, the downside of that is again, we just talked about you're going to run a little bit more fuel when you're running manifold vacuum. So, you know, the it's always going to be a little bit richer. Your AFR is going to always read a little bit richer when you're running manifold vacuum and the advance through the distributor. So you may be a more heavier smell of fuel at startup because you've got more fuel going through the system. That's what the manifold vacuum, you know, side needs. So just a couple of quick variations or times when you can use it, but for the most part, if you stick to that, if you have a really aggressive camshaft on a street car, go with the manifold vacuum. If you have a little bit less mild, I hate the term, but if you use like an RV cam, then great, use the timed vacuum, and that's where you start your tuning process with either one. Now let's talk about engine timing, and I'm going to try to draw this out the way my high school shop teacher taught me this, well, quite a few years ago. We won't talk about that, but let's talk about the engine timing and how it relates so we can understand where the advance comes in and the retard comes in and the timing. So let's call this top dead center up here. This will be bottom dead center down here. Okay, let's start with a event right here, first event, and then these are crankshaft rotation around until you finally get to the final event somewhere over here. Okay, so this first event is the intake valve opening. Okay, it is when the intake valve opens, you draw some suction from the manifold, or you know, the pressure that's in the cylinder from the piston drawing down, so it is essentially suction, I guess. And then somewhere down here you've got the intake valve closing. As you rotate around here and go through more, once the intake valve's closed, then I guess this stroke here becomes the compression stroke, because now both valves are closed, you're compressing, you're getting ready to go to the event where the plug fires, and you start to you know, get the timing that you need. So let's talk about once we get past the compression ratio or the compression stroke here, ends at top dead center. Okay, so the timing that occurs, let's just draw a line straight through this all and pretend that's straight. So we're talking about degrees of timing here. Anything after top dead center, we can look at as far as the retarding of the timing, but it's before top dead center that we need to concern ourselves with, because that is where that's where the timing event occurs. So if you look at that line straight through, well, I'm going to try to draw that again. That's a little ugly. I'm not an artist, I guess, as you figured out. So let's look at this straight line through here. That's much better. Top dead center, bottom dead center. When you look at degrees of timing of what's going on at top dead center and what's going on before that, that degree of timing there can change depending on where you're at in the curve. So let's say when you have initial of 15 degrees of timing before top dead center, let's say you set it at 15 degrees, that is where the plug fires here, and then it burns through, and then it gets to the other side of top dead center where it ends up done being burning the fuel and air mixture, and then you go into the exhaust side of it and spitting out the exhaust after you go through the power stroke, where you get all the power that you're getting from burning the fuel and air and the expansion of the gas within it. When you're putting more advance into it, all you're doing is putting more on this side of it. So let's say all in with your mechanical advance, vacuum advance, everything, you're at 35 degrees, which is typical. I mean, those are pretty average. That's all that means, is the time before top dead center that the plug fires and gives it time to burn. Now, why do you need more advance? Why do you need more timing? Because you need more time. Remember, we talked about that really at the beginning, is you need a little bit of time to burn fuel and air. It doesn't burn instantaneously. You have to have that time in the system. So when you need more time to burn it because you're under more load or more RPM, that's where the timing it advances. And that's what all that means is what's going on before top dead center. 15 degrees of crankshaft rotation before top dead center. Now let's talk about what's going on in the distributor when you talk about that timed or manifold vacuum system where you're using the vacuum pod on the distributor to control the timing. So if we look down in here, that vacuum pod, which either goes to your timed or manifold vacuum port, is connected to a little plate here. When you pull suction on that, it will pull this plate and twist it back that way. When you do that, this mechanism here that is attached to that plate is advanced. You will get it earlier. All of these little spikes here on the rotor or underneath here is where the timing occurs to fire the plug when it goes past the pickup here. When you advance that, you move this blue little sensor over and it fires the plug sooner. When you pull advance on from the manifold, it rotates the plate, turns it, gives you. Now, you've seen probably on the distributors, these plates here, it does the same thing. It advances the rotor and changes when it fires based on what's going on in the cap, in which terminal to hit. So when we're talking about that, that is what it is. That advanced pod is pulling that, it's rotating it, and it's changing the plate on the bottom in reference to where this is spinning based on the camshaft position, which is attached to the crank by a timing chain or hopefully not a gear drive. So that's what's happening internally in the distributor. Now I want to show you this one as well because it's a little bit different setup when we talk about going with a race type setup. This is more street. Everything here is contained. The only thing you need to make this run is a coil and then obviously the spark plug wires and you're good to go. This system here, the timing is not controlled by vacuum of the engine or by a mechanical advance within the distributor. It is controlled by the box. The ignition box controls the timing. Now when you talk about a locked out distributor, all that means is there is none of that mechanical advance going on inside the distributor. Again, it's all controlled by the box. Where it's triggered simply is picked up by that pickup and that little pole on there that tells it when it's going to fire each cylinder. That's a locked out distributor. It means there is no mechanical advance, no vacuum advance within it. Everything is done. Now, this happens to be the setup for the Chevelle. I am going to run an ignition box and that distributor. Again, you're going to get some people that are going to argue and say, well, you should always run a vacuum advance on the street. And I don't disagree with that. I think that's it's a great thing. It's not a bad situation. But for what I need, because I want the rev limiter and I want to run a two-step with this, then I need a little bit different ignition system, and I prefer to run it that way with an ignition box, a locked out distributor versus the mechanical advance and vacuum advance. The camshaft that I'm running is not too rowdy. I could run it off manifold vacuum, run that distributor and a coil and that setup and be just fine. But it's preference, and who knows, I may go back to a vacuum advance because it's not a 1,000 horse street engine. We're talking about a very mild 700 horse-ish big block. So I wanted to show you the difference between the two because it's important to understand what's going on inside the mechanical advance and the vacuum pod and what the locked out distributor looks like. So where should you start with all this? Honestly, the best place to start is always with the timed port. And if you don't get the characteristics of the thing running the way you want it to, it's sluggish, doesn't, throttle response isn't good, then you can always switch to the manifold vacuum at a different time. But again, with a mild cam, if you go straight to manifold vacuum with a mild cam, the throttle response can be a little bit more sluggish. There's too much vacuum pulling on that on the distributor and giving it too much advance, but the camshaft doesn't have enough, lift and duration to get things moving the way you need it to. So you need a little bit more time, and maybe the timed port's a better place to start. Again, if you have a really aggressive camshaft and you try to do it on the timed port, then again, it may be a little sluggish because you're not delivering enough fuel and air in there because the cam needs more. You're giving it more time to draw more fuel and air in, and you need more to keep things, making power the way you want to. So it's always a give and take, and that's the real challenge with it, and that's where the arguments always start with this, is neither one of these is perfect. That setup with, that I showed you a minute ago using the locked out distributor is not perfect either. Again, everything's a little bit of a give and take. The ported or the timed vacuum and the manifold vacuum, they both have their positives and negatives. One's really good at one, not so good at the other, and vice versa. So it's really kind of up to you what you decide to do, but always start with the timed. I've always had good luck with that, because even if you figure that, well, I have kind of a mild camshaft, but it's kind of on that 270, 280 advertised side, and maybe I need a little bit more, a little less initial timing in the distributor, great, I'll try it on the time side. Start with the timed. You can always switch to the manifold if it doesn't give you the results you're looking for. So everything we've discussed in the past in regards to tuning, it's a process. There's never a, bolt this carburetor on, use that distributor, and everything's perfect. It's always a process that you have to go through. You always have to go through all the steps. And if that means changing and working with different ports, whether it's timed or manifold, whether it's changing the mechanical advance, the weights, the springs, and the distributor to get it dialed in for your combination, then those are the things that you have to do. There's nothing that's perfect right out of the box. You're always going to have to carburetor tune. You're always going to have to tune the distributor. You're always going to have to work a little bit with the throttle body EFI. Whatever it is, you're always going to have to do a little bit of something with it. So keep that in mind when you're working, and especially when you're working on the vacuum side of the carburetor or throttle body to deliver to the distributor, you may have to change some things around. There is no clear definition that if you're using this camshaft, this compression ratio, intake manifold, header primary tube size, and so on and so forth, that here's all the settings that you use. Everything's different. Transmission's different. Your driving style's different. The torque converter's different. There are too many different variables in it. So just get used to the fact that you're going to have to do a little bit of tuning, and the more you tune, the better it's going to be when you get all said and done. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more understanding about what those two ports are and what they mean and when you can use them, and what maybe are some little differences between the two, and maybe when you can use one over the other. But again, it's just a process, and don't cheat yourself through it. Go through it and learn with it and figure out what the engine is demanding, and when you're all said and done, you'll have a much better running engine and car. So anyway, if you have any questions on this, don't hesitate, leave them down below. When we get down to doing the Chevelle here in hopefully a couple of months, when the thing's fired up, I will probably start with that easy run distributor, and then I will switch over to my race setup, I guess, if you want to call it that, with the locked out distributor and timing box, to show you the different process in the tuning. But those are a lot of videos down the road, so we won't even think about that yet. But again, if you got any questions, don't hesitate, leave them down below. Love to answer them for you, and we will catch you guys on the next video. We'll see you.